Hello and welcome to the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players of the gigging variety. I'm your host, David Holloway, and I'm pumped as always to be here with you. I'm flying solo tonight. Paul is off saving the world, but in the meantime, I'm really pleased to introduce this episode's guest. Mr. Dan Leavers, aka Danalogue, is a member of the iconic outfit The Comet is Coming. If you've not heard of The Comet is Coming, you need to do yourself a favour and check them out, even before you start listening to this podcast. They are an amazing three-piece outfit, and it's nearly impossible to quantify the genres that they cover with their music. They're in the middle of an international tour, and as you'll hear, Dan is arrived back from the US just yesterday and very kindly spent some time with us. I think you'll enjoy his perspective on a whole range of topics with his career, music, his approach to gear, two funny train wreck stories and a whole lot more. So hope you enjoy it, and I'll talk to you after the show. Dan, absolute pleasure to have you on the show, and I feel particularly privileged to have you on because you must be barely standing upright. I believe you got back from the US only yesterday.
Yeah, that's right. Back in London as of last night, and yeah, I'm still scraping my brain back together.
Yes.
My body's a bit confused, but on the whole, I'm very happy to be back, and it's nice and sunny in London right now, so good time to return.
And it's a big weekend coming up. I'm sure you'll be there in your with waving your flag for the coronation, Dan. Would that be accurate?
I will actually be DJing at a rave in Herefordshire. Actually, slightly different scene, but maybe there'll be some flag waving, but a different kind of flag. Maybe, like in the words of Jimi Hendrix, we'll be flying the freak flag.
That's what it's about. That's great. That's excellent. All right. So, no, as I said, great to have you here. So we'll kick off just for those that are unaware of your amazing body work. How did you start out in music? What got you first fired up as a kid and a teenager to decide this music thing was for you?
Yeah, it's hard to remember an exact moment, but I was definitely really keen on music. We listened to a lot of radio in the car. We listened to Capital Gold, which had a lot of hits from the 60s and 70s. I actually remember the first time I remember being moved to another place by music. It was a Diana Ross song. And I think Diana Ross on her old records just sounded, as a kid, I thought she sounded like an angel. And I spoke to my parents in the car and I was like, who is this? And she sounds so angelic. And I guess partly to do with kind of maybe the plate reverb on her voice and obviously her astonishing voice. But I was just like, wow, this woman must be incredible. But through the music. And then, yeah, my journey's been kind of wide and varied, I guess. But at that switch on moment, because for a lot of people, the music that they really switched on to when they're 16, 17, 18, that's the music that kind of, it's hard for that not to stay with you for the rest of your life. Like, that is me. It's a period of time where you're searching for an identity, I guess. You're trying to find your own kind of music. You've spent your childhood listening to other people's music. Now it's your turn to find your music. And I think I massively fell in love with, at first Nirvana, but then after that getting into 70s stuff. So I became deeply into Led Zeppelin and Yes and Black Sabbath and I really rock about like The Who, a lot of British rock bands from the 70s, and that really just changed my life. I think listening to records that sounded like cool, like, you know, the riffs were cool and the sound of it, the production sounded so cool to me. This is a world to inhabit. So that was how it would, I don't know, that it's so hard to talk about this. I could talk about this for literally like probably 5 hours on its own. But that's a very brief overview.
And did you do any sort of formal instruction as far as piano, keyboard, anything like that?
Do you know what? I was a terrible pupil of the piano. And I actually wanted to, I asked my parents, could I go and learn piano? I actually said, like, I think I'm gonna be really good at piano when I was about like 4 years old, and I went when I was older. They thought I needed to be like 7 or 8, and I went. But you know what, David, I was like so bad at doing the practice in between the lessons, and as time wore on, I remember getting home the first day from a lesson and being like, cool, well, I've got like 7 days, so this week I'm gonna do it. Really, I'm gonna do it, but I can have one day off. I'll have one day off, and then it get to the second day, I'd be like, well, I'll be fine as long as I start tomorrow. And then it would be on the day, and I'd just be bricking it. I'd feel so guilty. I feel so like I'm letting down the teacher. And she was cool. She never like had a go at me, but I could see the slight disappointment in her eyes that I was still at the same level as I was the week before. And it was that feeling. I didn't like that feeling of letting someone down like that. And so I actually, after not very long at all, a couple of years, I just said to my folks, I was like, do you know what? I really don't want to do these lessons anymore. And they were super cool about it. I thought they were going to be really upset that they'd wasted all this time. But they were like, yeah, just do you. You know, if you're not enjoying it, don't do it. And the funny thing about that was I then started playing piano every day because I could play whatever I wanted. And that might just be like messing around on the black notes for 2 hours, or it might just be like playing around doing whatever. But I suddenly started playing like over an hour a day just because I could do whatever I wanted. And so that's how I actually taught myself pretty much on piano. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, nothing wrong with being self-taught, and I totally sympathise with the practicing. So, no, that's great. So did you end up in bands? Probably not even the best. So how did you end up working with other people on music, either during high school or soon after?
Yeah, I immediately got into bands. So I was just like, bands are the coolest thing, and I was obsessed with watching. The Song Remains the Same soundtrack video by Led Zeppelin, and I just thought at their gig at Madison Square Garden, and I just thought like doing a rock show like that was like the coolest thing ever. And I played a bit of sax, and I also had I got my Roland SH9 kind of early when I was about 16 years old, so I was in this cool band where we play these sick riffs, which I still think are some brilliant riffs that we had. And we'd had the guitar player would play riffs, the bass player would be playing it, and I'd be playing it on the SH9 on quite a thick kind of saw wave. So we play this huge sound, like triple riff, and the guitarist had an octave pedal, so it was like quadruple riffs. It was like, and we did pretty well. We were only 17. I think we disbanded by the time we were like 18, 19, but we were in Brighton and we had quite a big following. We were playing some decent shows. We were kind of the toast of Brighton, I reckon, for about 6 months, but we were all quite stoners, so we didn't really, and there was no real clear pathway yet. There wasn't MySpace yet. There wasn't really a pathway apart from getting signed. We were at the tail end of that time, so it was really hard to find that pathway. And it's like, well, how do you move on from just like packing out a pub and it being like the best night of everyone's lives, but how do you translate that, especially being in Brighton, which does seem like a little bubble of its own. But yeah, immediately we were making some cool music. Yeah, I don't know how many bands you want me to go through, but I played in quite a few bands after that.
Well, probably the good question, Dan, is what got you to the point where you decided I'm going to do this full-time versus having a highly successful career in call centers?
Well, do you know what? I only went fully full-time Danalogue when I was 30.
Okay.
And so it took a while. But becoming full-time musician was different because I did like session musicianship and I played for some pretty decent bands too and did some world tours. But then it's like across my whole life, it's been staggered. So it's like at first you say, yeah, working at call centers, offices, pizza delivery was a good one because you could listen to albums while you're driving around delivering pizza. It's incredible, just pumping out the jams, delivering pizza. And then I was like, all I want to do is make enough money, you know, playing music. And then so I was doing, you know, I was doing anything. I was playing in loads of bands, like loads of covers bands and things that people, you know, look down upon. But I don't know, like the Beatles did Hamburg, so, you know, Alice Cooper used to do covers. So I was just out there drilling it, but still working a day job. And then I started doing these quite decent sessions and making much better money and playing some huge shows. And then I was like, well, this is great. Wouldn't it be cool to be Danalogue, you know, and just play my synths that I want to play, you know, the SH9 and the Juno. And then I started that mission when I was like 27. And then by the time I was 30 and I moved to London, yeah, I was just like, I just don't want to play for anyone else anymore. And I did a few more tours with other artists that I just really liked.
So let's talk a little bit about that, Dan, just from a learning viewpoint, because we're certainly going to cover your work in some depth there. So what were some of those bigger tours that particularly stood out for you as a great learning experience on how to put across a great live performance, you know, and get an audience on board, stuff like that?
Yeah, it was one band I was playing with, this singer-songwriter, and he wasn't like huge or anything, but he was the support act for the Stranglers on a whole UK tour. So I got to go around all the O2 academies or arenas or whatever with the Stranglers and watch them every night. And as a kid growing up, I loved that tune Peaches, you know, the riff on that, like down, 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 I was like, that's a killer riff. And when they played it live, people threw their beers in the air. So it went dan, and on the bit where the drums go, everyone threw their beers in the air, and this huge 3,000 cap place, and I just thought it was the best thing ever. Like,
you've got a major Strangler fan here, Dan, and who went to a Stranglers gig only 2 weeks ago, so I'm hearing you.
Yeah, and then then there's a band called James who are very popular in the UK, and they broke up around the time I was like 24, 25, and Tim Booth, the lead singer from that band, went solo. And I was his keyboard player for a tour there, and that was amazing. You know, I met Brian Eno backstage, who'd done a load of albums with James, and all the rest of the band were in their 40s, so I was like the young gun, and that was an incredible experience because Tim is a real gentleman and a very deep guy, and he showed me a lot about band leadership. Because I played with a lot of like younger players, and there was a lot of egos and stuff like that, but he wasn't like that at all. And you know, he could walk across people's hands. He didn't stage dive, he stage walked. He'd walk out in the crowd, everyone holding him up, and he's very beloved by his fans, almost messianic character. But in the rehearsal room, he just spoke really softly, and he was just like, Dan, I just think you're very creative, and just play whatever you want. Just listen, and I trust you. And it was incredible at that age to have a great artist like that go, you know, I trust you, do your thing. And that was beautiful. And we did a lot of incredible shows. And we had whole sections where I would be going so hard on the keys, and he'd come right over and like dance right in my face and stuff. And that was really when I came out of that, and we've been playing, like, it was really eye-opening. We played in Manchester, and that's where James, that band, are from. Tim Booth's from Manchester. And the album, his solo album, had been released 3 days before the gig in Manchester. And we came out and we played the first song off the new album. It had only been out 3 days, and the whole crowd sung along.
Oh, wow.
They'd learnt the song in 3 days. That's how much they loved the music. So it was really moving. And I was just like, it's interesting watching someone like that crowd control and deliver a show, and people there hanging on every word, every moment, and being like, I want to do this. You know, I like playing other people's music, but I want to do this, but with my music, you know. And so actually at the end of that tour, Tim was like, Dan, come move to LA. We kind of had a real bromance, and he was like, come and move to LA, move in with my family, let's make an album together. And something told me, as much as I love that idea, and he was just like, you know, we'll do something with Eno, you know. So I was just like, oh my gosh, what an opportunity. I knew I needed to follow my own path, and even though it sounds crazy, continue the work I was doing, making quite strange music in my duo Soccer96, and he thought it was a crazy move of me to keep doing that, but that led me on the path that I'm on now.
So before we get onto Soccer96, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about, you said you met Brian Eno backstage. Did you manage to actually have a chat, and how did you approach that? Because I don't think I could spit out a sentence.
I did. And well, do you know what? Like, so many great people, he made me feel comfortable, and he made me feel at ease, and he had a kind of almost Buddha-like smile. I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying that. And he just looked very chuffed to be there backstage, and he just spoke to me, you know, like a peer, and I really respect that. Him and I can't remember if it was him or Tim that night said to me, they're like, look, the more people you play to, the bigger crowds and the more adulation you get, you can almost go two paths. One is to become a bit arrogant and conceited about the whole thing, or you can have like less ego and more love and more gratitude. And they were like, look, you're only 25 or whatever, just choose the right path almost. And yeah, I think Eno was great. I mean, the worst thing about it was actually my mum was at that gig, and she, it was brilliant. She was like, my parents are both at that gig, and they wanted to come backstage. And I said to them before we went in the door, I was like, look, guys, just be cool, all right? Like, they'd never come backstage with me before, ever. And I was just like, look, be cool, all right? But Brian Eno's backstage. And then we went in to the backstage, and I just said that, and then my mum just said in this really loud voice, she was like, Brian Eno's here, like that. And I was just like, Mum, play it cool. But I was like, Mum. But no, he was really nice, and he said some flattering things about my playing, and yeah, it was great.
That's excellent. So you mentioned Soccer96, Dan, and I mean, I've listened to quite a range of the work here, and I love it. It's totally up my alley. So tell us about how that came together initially and how that developed for you.
Oh, well, yeah, thanks, David. It basically, when I met Max, who I play with now in The Comet Is Coming, he's also in Soccer96. So we're like 18 years old. We're in Brighton. I'm coming out the back of that heavy riff band I was just talking about. And we made this kind of 6-piece post-rock band. And our first gig was supporting The Silver Mount Zion, who's a side project of Godspeed, You Black Emperor. It was like, come on. It felt really blessed. We're like, okay, well, the first gig is supporting these guys from Godspeed who we kind of idolized. And we're like, well, this is good. And then we did a bunch of shows, and I was kind of running it on the recording and rehearsal side of things. You had Elizabeth Walling, who later became Gazelle Twin. She was in the band and was like really like leading things as well, on the kind of in different ways, and it was a fantastic band. And we had a strong amount of recordings on MySpace, but you know what? We never put anything out, so I think now you can't find anything. But it was really incredible, and I was just mixing everything on my laptop, but that was an incredible band. But with that imploded down to too many cooks spoiling the broth. And at the end of that, I was so exhausted, having played with this riffy band that disbanded with 5 members, then playing in a 6-piece post-rock band, really swollen kind of amount of people and ego and all sorts. I was like, well, who can I not live without playing in that band? And it was Max. He's such a superb drummer, And I was just like, what if we make a duo? Because suddenly you don't have to ring up 5 people to organize a rehearsal. You don't have to run every decision through 5 other people and it take ages and it's all by committee. It would be so easy in a lot of ways. And I'd recently procured the Juno, and I was just like, well, if I can play Juno with one hand and the SH9 mono synth with the other hand, and then there's a great drummer and maybe a loop pedal. I was really listening to a lot of Square Pusher at that point, so I was just like, beautiful sounds with beautiful synths, and then an incredible drummer. This could really work. So that was really the beginnings of Soccer96, and we called it a crazy name because we were coming out this time where there's loads of bands, you know, bands were the thing, but we didn't want to be like a band, you know, and call it like the Crystal Jars or whatever everyone's been, you know. We wanted to call it something that kind of sounded a bit strange, a bit like, oh, we're not an actual real band. We're a couple of weirdos, you know. and that was the beginnings of Soccer96. So that was way back in like 2010. So me and Max have been playing together now for more than half of our lives.
Exactly. And I mean, your latest album was only out last year, wasn't it? Inner Worlds?
Yeah. So yeah, during the pandemic, we recorded enough music for 2 more LPs. And yeah, Dopamine, Inner Worlds in a way is not the B-sides, but Dopamine we put a lot of work into, and then we suddenly realized we had all these extra tracks that didn't quite fit on Dopamine, and Inner Worlds was like that. But in the end I was like, actually Inner Worlds is almost like a better record. That was just like, oh my god, when we did Soccer96 originally, we were on such a shoestring. We were both working in jobs. We both had like 3 other bands, spread betting, see what's gonna work. We didn't have any experience but I still wanted to record and mix everything myself. We made like really lo-fi records, so we didn't even have a record label. We put the first record out ourselves, and you know, had no idea what we were doing. I had to find out how to put things online, and we're, you know, and then so by the time you come full circle, you do a load of records, get proper record labels you're working with, and then Comet comes along. We've made like 5 or 6 albums and got really good at mixing. We've made a bit of money. I've got a Space Echo now, the real one. You know, I'm like, I've even got a studio. And then so I was just like, I feel like we could make the Soccer96 record that we never had the chance to make because we were too busy, like making ends meet and kind of. And I was like, let's just make that record, because it was the pandemic. We weren't on tour, and it was so fun. I really feel like we achieved that aim. It's like make a record with the experiences and the professionality that we gained over like the past like 10 years. So yeah, that was really cool to put out some new soccer material. And we would have toured it more, but we had some huge touring to do with Comet is Coming, so we had to switch back into Comet mode. Well,
let's switch to Comet mode now for a while. So again, tell us about the development of that, and we've mentioned in our introduction just what amazing diverse music this is, and certainly different even to Soccer96. Like they are just chalk and cheese, which is a testament just to your diversity as a composer and player as well. Tell us about how that came together.
So it was a really exciting time. I had just moved to London. There's this place called the Total Refreshment Centre in Dalston, Stoke Newington, and a kind of really enthusiastic, risk-taking French hip-hop lover and jazz aficionado, Alexis Blondin, had set up this crazy warehouse spot with, you know, a few bedrooms, a few studios. They did crazy parties and gigs up there, really underground lo-fi scene. And there was a studio kind of just starting to be built, had a couple of little bits and bobs in there. and this guy Capital K, who's a brilliant artist and recording engineer and mix and producer, he was kind of putting a few of his bits in there. And then Max was living there. And then Jack, who I was living with in Brighton, he put some of his stuff up there. And it started to just gradually form up there. And me and Max with Soccer96 did one of the first ever shows they put on there. We did the second ever gig there. And Max lived there, and we just rehearsed there. We did everything there, and we were like right part of that ground zero moment at this very exciting, multidisciplinary, kind of rebellious space. And then, so basically, I had the trust of everyone there. The Capital K trusted me. We both listened to a lot of each other's records, and then we were like, he trusted me to set up, and record using some of his stuff, and then we brought some of our stuff. And so me and Max just suddenly thought we've just got to record everything ourselves to tape, old school, to this little Tascam 8-track. And so we started doing that, and then a few weeks later we just had a random jam with Shabaka, the saxophone player, at this gig in Brixton. And then Max had the kind of the nous to say, well, look, let's record it in the studio now. And we had just been doing stuff with Soccer96, and we had a method. I was even engineering it. I had the settings, taken a picture of it on the desk. So I was like, well, adding sax is easy. It's just one more channel. So we had the settings there. We had a method. We used to just put a tape on and just jam. And then I'd put it into my computer, and then we just work it all out in the mix. And then so Shabaka came in, and I think he was doing some very serious stuff. He was doing some free jazz stuff. He had big plans with his, at that point, fledgling band, Sons of Comet. And he was just like, who are these two kind of crazy guys at this kind of, do-it-yourself kind of recording ethos, recording to tape in this really freaky building. And so we just jammed out for like 3 days, and we had people coming in dancing, we had people coming in filming, it was very chaotic and organic. And then, that stuff just sat on my computer for about a couple of years. Again, we were still doing loads of other jobs. We were still playing with a lot of other people. I was still mixing stuff for people. We were going on little tours, and I just tinkered away with it on my computer. And then every now and then, whenever we got a chance, Max and I would get together in my bedroom and produce this stuff and mix it and add parts and add effects. And, like there's a record that got nominated for a Mercury Music Prize called Channel the Spirits. And I can remember laying down the bass to one of the tracks on my bed in Brighton, going into, just going into a cheap interface, no preamp, nothing. And it was amazing, really, making that album, and it was crazy. We'd had some experiences where we'd worked with industry people, and they try to change our sound and change our method and be like, oh, you need to rehearse and you need to do things properly the way people should do it. And then at this point, we just got fed up with all that, and we were just like, let's just make the album 100% that we want to make, no compromise. Let's go all the way to space. Let's put all the synth parts we want to put on it. Let's just go crazy. And with that kind of fulcrum of having like these kind of sax melodies in there to give it that kind of trifecta, it just really worked. And then with the backing of a good label for the first time in our whole life, on Leaf label, a fantastic independent label, with the backing of a proper decent label, it just flew, just
took off from there.
Took off.
And so let's talk a little bit more about the recording, because I know in other interviews you've talked about tape. So it sounds to me like it's a two-part process. You're literally recording to tape, but it sounds like you're then hopefully feeding that into the computer. You're not having to get your razor blades out old style?
You know what? Much to my embarrassment and shame, I have never got the razor blades out on the tape. And I've been meaning to do it. Look, I've even got, you can see in the background here, I've got this is my 16 track right there.
Oh yeah, yep.
Harley. But I love recording to tape, you know, for so many reasons, and you know, not least it just sounds incredible. What we realized is, because we write so often through spontaneous composition, or, you know, a less pretentious way of putting it might be just jamming for jamming for our lives, just, you know, really improvising a lot. If we set up with proper microphones and record it onto tape, when you hit play and listen back, it already sounds amazing. It sounds like a record. If you're all playing properly, you know, and you treat it as seriously as you would if you're performing a classical concert, but you're not, you're in the studio improvising. If something about the magic of the tape, because if you're on laptop and you do that, you could probably leave it running for like 4 hours and you might burn yourself out, or you wouldn't be as urgent, maybe.
That's right.
There's only about half an hour of tape that makes that process so poignant and potent, because you've got to get something in that half an hour, otherwise you just wasted a tape. And it's that bottled energy, which I believe is part of the urgency of the sound of The Comet Is Coming, which is why when I found that name for the band, it was like, it made so much sense, because it sounds urgent. It sounds like, holy moly, you know, something going to happen that's really shocking.
It's a great point. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. So did you come across it in literature, or just made it up, or?
Well, the guys, I like ribbing the guys about this, because they both came up with some like terrible band names.
Don't we all?
But they were like really proactive. They were like, we need to come up with a band name. I think at first they wanted it to be Soccer96 featuring Shabaka, and I actually said, look, I don't want this to be a Soccer96 record. And it's funny looking at it now, because Comet has become way more successful. But I was just like, I like doing bits of vocals on Soccer. It had a sound. I was like, this is different because it's got so much saxophone. And actually renaming it in the end, with hindsight, was a stroke of genius, because it meant that when we put it out, it was like this fresh band, you know. It started on a new footing. So that was great. And the guys came up with some terrible names, which I'm not going to say because they're too funny. But we still joke about it sometimes backstage, what would have happened. I think one of the guys came up with the name Silver Fox, which I think is what the band would have just felt like listening to it. It's called Silver Fox. I'm sure it would have been as successful.
Oh, that's funny.
But anyway, and I was just like, they were trying really hard to come up with a name, and I was just like, that's never been my style. I like to let something speak to me, you know, and that's just the way I work. And I'm like, let's just don't force it. Something will come. Like, something will just appear. You know, let's just trust in something's going to appear. And then so we went downstairs, and at the time, beneath the studio, there was a vinyl library where you could rent out 5 vinyls a week, and people like Giles Peterson, Andrew Ashon had their vinyls down there. So it's an incredible selection. As I say, this was a happening time. I can't believe I'm now that guy who can talk about the past with these kind of roasted classes. But there was this BBC Radiophonics workshop, and we were at record, and we were on a break, and we just went down there to play some records. And I just started looking at it. It had a cosmic cover, and I flipped it around, and it was like kind of like Radiophonic workshop, kind of little bits to put on TV shows, maybe like kind of library stuff. And the last track on it was called "The Comet Is Coming," and I just speechless, and I just looked over at Shabaka, and I was pointing at it, just looking at him. I was pointing at it with a kind of raised eyebrow, which, you know, I was trying to say, what do you think about this? And he just kind of looked at me and just kind of like nodded, like kind of like, yeah. And we didn't even say anything, but it was like we knew he'd found the name. And I rang up Max. I was like, Max, get down here. Something incredible was happening. And I think once we came up with that name, everything just made so much sense.
Took off from there. And for those that outside of the UK, Although I think US people might be broadly aware of the BBC and just how iconic some of those BBC Sound Library vinyl records were over many years, all those sound effects ones. They're just iconic. So I love the fact that your name came from that.
Oh, mate. And it's like the BBC is public funded, you know, it still is. And at that time, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, all of the sound effects and soundtracks were made like in-house. And they just bought all this incredible like synths and tape machines and effects. And you just they paid, someone's job was to be down there making crazy effects for like sci-fi. Like, oh, today can you make a load of tape echo reverse sounds for like a UFO scene in Doctor Who? It's like, wow, what a job.
Yeah,
They don't have it anymore, but definitely a big inspiration for me. Those guys, you know, Delia Derbyshire and all those cats, they were incredible.
No, absolutely. And so, Dan, you've given a really wonderful insight into the improvisational aspects of what the Comet is doing. So I'm fascinated to know, when you do tour, obviously you've released albums, you've got songs, how faithfully do you try to replicate those songs, and even do you want to do that, or is it more a bit of a jam with the similar chords? Like, how do you approach actually doing songs live versus what you've recorded?
Well, you know, I love tracks. I don't think we've ever wanted to be a band like the Grateful Dead or something where we're actually like a jam band, quote unquote. I think that's how we come up with some of the initial material. But there's, you know, we'll do a 3-day recording session, get like 9 hours of material, but then Max and I will spend 3-4 months, you know, every day with those long extended jams, creating tracks. And, you know, I love pop music, you know, I love Stevie Wonder, you know, I love singles. And, you know, so we've got that track, Summon the Fire, is probably our best known track. And it's like, it's a pop track, really. And so when we play it live, yeah, I want it to sound like that. Maybe there's a slight extended solo in there, or like live. I don't know. I see the studio and live as two separate things, but I do like to play the song. But what we tend to do is kind of, as I said earlier, I had an obsession with Led Zeppelin and Song Remains the Same soundtracks like that. Like there's a 27-minute version of Dazed and Confused on there, which I think got panned by the critics for being a bit grandiose, but I loved it. I actually used to listen. I used to be able to know. I knew every bass note, every drum fill, every guitar lick, every like ad lib that Robert Plant did, and so I love that as well. So the way we built the set is we tend to have the tracks, and then but we have little extensions and we have little moments in the set that only exist live, because I love that about Zeppelin's live set, where they really stretch out and do stuff that they've got new riffs and stuff that they're not on the records, they're just live. And so we do that. We kind of play the songs pretty faithfully, but then we augment them with like little sections and little offshoot bits, and maybe there's a longer solo here, or there's an extra solo there, or there's a drum break here, you know. But we like to play the
as is. But given you're distilling so much wonderful improvisational work down to those actual songs, did you find you still had to relearn them before touring? Because obviously, yeah.
Yeah, and that's actually really hard. It's like, depending on how many overdubs are done, like something like, well, it isn't. It's basically like certain song, like if the parts have been written in the studio, in the jam, well, then the drums are the drums, the sax are the sax, and then my part, if I've managed to play bass and Juno in the live session on that track, it can actually be fairly simple. Like Summon the Fire, that track, it is kind of, I'm playing bass, synth and chords simultaneously, but it's fairly simple, the parts, and I do think that's partly why we've got such a kind of simple sound in some respects, like an approachable sound, because it's just like I can only do so much with two hands and playing bass and the chords. So sometimes it's simple, but sometimes I'm just playing the bass and I'm like, I want to spend time with this. I want to spend a few days like really getting into an orchestral setup on the synth. Like the opening track on Trust in the Life Force of the Deep Mystery is a track called Because the End is Really the Beginning. And I went to town on that one. There's like string synths, there's like multiple overdubs of like different mono synths, there's loads of different effects that I was putting on there. And so tracks like that, live, we don't bother trying to make it sound like the record. We just go, well, this is what it sounds like live. And, you know, and that's cool too, you know, like rock bands back in the day, yeah, there'd be like double track guitars, sometimes triple track guitars, but live there's just one, and that's cool. That's why you're there. You don't need backing tracks and any of that.
No, and that was what I was about to ask you, Dan. Given the diversity of some of your music, whether you did need to use backing tracks, but essentially what you're saying is you're taking a live view on each song and reinterpreting them that way.
Yeah, and you know what? I did when we played in Brighton. We did a UK tour for like 3 or 4 weeks in March and April, and someone came up to me after a show and said, "So how do you do the backing tracks?" And I was like, "What?" I can't explain how much I'm doing and how much pains I'm going to be able to play what I'm playing live. On the Juno, I have got it's the Juno 60 now, so I can change patches, and I've got a foot switch which changes patches, which is awesome. So it means in one song I can play with 2 hands, and I could switch my left foot, I can switch patches. And I'm also filtering stuff, and I've also got a huge pedal, like guitar pedal rig beneath me that I'm switching pedals, and I'm playing chords, and I'm playing the bass, and I'm filtering, and I'm changing envelopes. And then someone's there being like, "How are you doing the backing tracks?" I was like, "Oh my God." I almost like, I remember saying at one of the shows, I referenced that, and I tried as humbly as possible. I was like, maybe we're making this look too easy, because I don't want people to think it's backing tracks, because this is 100% live.
Absolutely. Maybe they think it's backing tracks because you just stand there as still as a stone. You don't bloody move at all, do you? That was sarcasm. You're one of the most energetic players I've seen live.
I will say maybe there is a bit of that. We're so used to seeing DJs and electronic artists, maybe with a lot of backing track and then like tweaking stuff. And I do tweak stuff, and it looks similar, I think, to sometimes people using a MIDI controller, where you're used to seeing the elbow up and someone throwing the dials around. But yeah, I filmed a gig with a head cam, and it's not up yet, but it will be up.
Wow, that'd be great. Yeah,
I'm making a series of videos of me playing live at gigs, and then everyone can see what I'm doing.
That is brilliant.
That'd be cool, because at the end of the day, like if you do take the synths out, you're left with drums and saxophone, which, you know, the guys are some of the best players in the world, but you know, it does make up quite a lot of the sound. So
absolutely,
there's a lot going on up there.
And look, backing tracks have their place, Dan, but I know I saw David Byrne on his American Utopia tour, and he used to cop the same criticism for using backing tracks because all his musicians were mobile. I don't know whether you've ever seen any of the clips. And so what he did to prove that was actually built a song from the ground up for the audience, with each of the members showing what they do as it built up. So maybe that's what you need to do.
Brilliant. Yeah, I know. I do. That's a really good idea. No shade at all on people who use backing tracks. It's just like not what we do. But I do, you know, I've got all the love for any music that is, you know, impactful and moves people in any way people make it. But it's just the way we make it is so pointedly live. They just amuse me greatly. But there's certain things with my synths, you know, like there is a sustain pedal on my Juno, and it's different from a sustain pedal on like a piano, where you put the sustain pedal down on a piano, you play a chord, and it hangs for a bit. On the Juno, you put the sustain pedal on, you can just hold a chord like forever. So sometimes what I do is I'll hold a chord, put a chord down, hold it on sustain, and then I'm using 2 hands up on the SH9. So if you didn't know what's going on, you might be like, oh, well, there's a chord there, and no one's
Underneath,
playing.
yeah.
And so there's a lot of little moves that I've built over time of just playing this way with these two exact same synths for 20 years. There's little moves I've got to be able to do as much as I can within the limitations of, you know, having two hands and 2 feet. And then sometimes, you know, I've put a mod on my Junos now, so any Juno heads out there will know there's a key transpose button on a Juno, but you have to hold it down. So there's an old trick where people used to put gaffer tape and hold it down. And with that, you can play a chord and then you can move the chord around. It sounds quite ravey. But I've put a mod on mine, which is probably the most pragmatic mod ever. But I've put a clicker button on there now, so you can click down the key transpose, and then I can hold a chord, and then I can be filtering and moving the chord around all at once, and it's
Cool.
It's kind of mad. But I love stuff like that. Just seeing what I can do to like make the Juno, you know, do as much as I can do, but playing completely live.
Absolutely. And so let's talk a little bit about your rig. And I know in some ways it's simple, but in other ways it's incredibly complex. So just run through, before the Comet is coming, you know, live gig, how you have it set up.
Yeah, so I just have the Juno 60 out there, and then on top I have a stereo delay pedal, and then that runs into a little compressor which sits on top, and that compressor has a sidechain which is running off the kick, so I can basically be playing chords and have a little ducking sidechain compression there on the Juno, which I remember when we first integrated that, and I was just like listening to a lot of like the kind of beat scene out in like Los Angeles and West Coast, and they were all ducking their synths. Obviously there's like French electro and Daft Punk and everyone like that's been doing that for ages, but there's this kind of waviness to the kick, just bumping the Juno, and I was just like, how can we do that live? So we've just got a little kick trigger. So that's pretty much it with the Juno. And then I have the SH9 up on top, which is largely bass. But I also switch up to do high melodies, and it's got a very satisfying octave switch, which I use a lot to an effect. And then that's running through a whole bunch of pedals like chorus, flanger, delays, harmonizers, all sorts of stuff, and that gives me loads of range then for different like bass sounds and different kind of melody and solo stuff. And recently I added a Moog or Moog for a couple of tracks of bass. But yeah, as you say, it's really simple. Initially it's just like Juno, SH9, these are my guys, these are my babies, my and sonically it created this palette that I just fell in love with, and I just didn't feel the need to play any other synths really since I was like 17, 18. I'm pretty obsessive like that, and I was just like, I just love any chord you bring up on the Juno. I'm like, oh, it's beautiful, I love it. And then like the SH9 is just so much personality in it, so much buzz, it's so aggressive, it's so kind of thick and juicy, but it's like it doesn't have as much sub as a Moog, but that's cool because our sound guy just dials in a bit of extra sub. And it's such a ripper, honestly. It's so much buzz, so much grit, and kind of filthy, almost guitar like kind of sound now and then. And yeah, I kind of treat them more like guitar, like bass guitar and guitar. I just play chords, I got my bass lines. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. But as you say, there's complexity to it. Because I'm like, well, how can I make this more deft? How can I tweak the filters here and there across the track? How can I change patches? You know, and I've just developed all these little moves that I do on them, and yeah, it's been a lot.
That's amazing. And yeah, and I have no doubt you haven't found the boundaries of those two yet either, so I think there's still a lot more to go. And I'm guessing you can experiment with other pieces of gear both in your other outfits and also your solo work. I mean, I know on top of everything else you did through the pandemic, you released a solo album with Alabaster de Plume. Tell us about that, because again, it's got some similarities in sound, but again, it really isn't. It's an amazing sort of piece of work. Tell us about, again, how that came about and what itch that scratched for you versus everything else you were doing.
Well, do you know what? It's one of those funny ones where I feel like me and Alabaster de Plume, we're kind of like odd. We're an odd couple because we just became really good friends. And he always came from this kind of more folky poetry scene, and I was like very much into like rave culture at the time, like electronic music, and and it was bizarre. I think we just bonded over. We could just sink quite a few beers, you know. I was like, I respect I respect a guy who can like hand his beers, you know. And we got really into like chatting about politics and all this stuff, and then eventually, after we just had enough nights of, you know, chatting the chat, we're like, well, should we record some stuff? So we just started jamming. Just made an album together. And I think he was just fascinated at the level of aggression I've sometimes got in my playing, because it's so different from how he makes music, which is normally really soft and subtle. And I think he was just like, oh, just do your thing, and he'll do some bits as well. And I don't know, it was very interesting process, but we intentionally kept it really raw and lo-fi and a bit ragged, and recorded synth through like guitar amps and stuff, and we were trying to make it as kind of punky as possible and its kind of ethos. And then in post I did a bit of mixing on it to try, and I suddenly was like, oh man, this is so raw. I did a little bit of mixing and production on it, but yeah, it was one of those ones where it was just like, to be honest, I meet so many great musicians. I would love to put out a different album every week if I could. But it's like anyone who's like, you know, done stuff properly in the music industry, it's like everything takes a lot of time. If you want to really put a lot of love into a record, and you've got a good label there, and you want to do a whole album cycle on a tour and really do it properly, you've got to really spend like 2 or 3 years, like at least on an album cycle. And part of me feels a bit guilty for putting out records and then not pouring loads of love into it, which I know it needs to kind of break out of, you know, there's so much music. You really want to give it the best chance it's got. But that record, yeah, it's out there, and I'm very proud of it. And I'd say it's more of a collaboration between me and Alabaster de Plume, and less of a solo album. But there's more on its way, basically, that I've been tinkering with. So I think the true solo album, the Synth Odyssey, is on the horizon.
Great. Very much looking forward to that. And are you using a range of gear, or sticking to some tried and true friends, or?
Yeah, I do like my tried and true friends. There's a few extra bits now. I've actually got an original 808 now, which I'm very lucky to have. It actually used to belong to Jeff Beck, the guitarist.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's quite a crazy story where he'd given it to a guy who used to repair his thatched roof on his house as payment for some roofing. And then that guy never really used it, and he was selling it really cheap through my synth repairman, and I went and got it. And it's it's amazing, all the gear I've got. I've picked up from such crazy situations with people who normally don't know what it is properly, and selling it like
wow.
But so I've got this 808 and I've got a 101 now. So what I'm getting into is connecting everything together, and all from the Roland. I'm kind of obsessive, so I kind of got the Juno. I've now got this Jupiter 4, which is from a similar era, and I've got this Roland VP 330 vocoder and string synth.
Oh yeah,
strings on it, magnificent. And then what I'm loving about synths is, you know, there was a period where you had some keyboards that they'd have all the presets on it, say clarinet, you know, oboe, strings, whatever, and it would sound terrible. It didn't sound anything like those. And then now you have, say, amazing plugins of like orchestral strings, which is like, I'm sure people are just using those for movie soundtracks. They sound unbelievable, like East West, or you know, all these different companies. And it's like, okay, but there's this kind of weird middle ground of, say, like string synths, like the Selena, or like this VP330, or the Roland RS09, where they start to become their own thing. It doesn't sound like identical to strings, and it doesn't sound like a rubbish version of strings. It's like become its own thing. And then sometimes you put like the ensemble or the chorus on, and it's just gorgeous. So I think, yeah, I'm getting a little bit more into string synths, and I kind of am curious about getting into maybe a Prophet.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Because I jammed on one in Los Angeles the other day, and in the Guitar Center, and I was. It is one of, you know, it's as obvious as all keyboard players know, but you know, of course, you play a chord, you play the same chord on any keyboard, and you just immediately got this whole other sound. You know, I could be playing what I'm playing on a Hammond, and it would sound so different. Sometimes I play Comet is Coming tunes on a grand piano. Suddenly you're like, oh, it's very classy, actually. But it's funny, you know, that I have played the Juno for like 20 years, because it's like the chords you're playing are the same, but the scope of it, and the sound, the palette, and the richness, and the difference in the tone is so different on the Prophet. It's like incredible. So I might be tempted, but they're quite pricey, I will say.
They are quite pricey, yes. But yeah, you're only human. No, that's great, Dan. Great perspective. And just while one last question about live, have you had any notable train wrecks where things have gone just horrifically wrong for you technically? It sounds like you've got a very robust setup, but you know, I'm assuming something's gone wrong sometime.
Oh, so many. You wouldn't believe. I mean, do you know what? A lot of it's before I got into the Juno, and like when I played with Tim Boo, for instance, I was playing off a laptop, so I was using like Logic Mainstage and using all the sounds of the album, but I still went really hard, if not harder then, you know, I was 24, whatever, and I was just rocking out so hard on stage. And there's this bit, as I say, Tim would come right over to me, the singer, rocking out, and we were going for it. We were in Greece, in Patras, and I had the laptop set up on a guitar amp to look kind of cool. And I was going in so hard that the laptop just fell off. And I watched it. And it wasn't my laptop. It was given to me by the whole crew. And it fell onto the floor. And I watched it close, like snap shut. And at that point, there's no sound. And I'm playing and it cuts out. And I saw Tim just look me dead in the eye. And then he just turned around and went up the other side of the stage and carried on. And at the end of that, he was like, Dan, that's not your fault. It should be gaffer taped down. You're
Yes.
I want you to perform. And so that was, it wasn't the reason, but it's one of the reasons why I just love like a keyboard where its own job is to be a keyboard. It doesn't do email. It doesn't do Facebook. You plug it in. You've got it switched on. You can't, it's not like a laptop where it just will close or close down or glitch out. Or I just love playing two old keyboards. So they've got a jack input. That's all they do. All they want to do is be keyboards. Yeah, that happened to me a couple of times with Tim Booth, I have to say. I was a little bit too rowdy, really, to play that kind of MIDI laptop setup. And
I think that validates the fears of every musician out there with a laptop, including me. You always wait for something like that to happen.
Oh my gosh. But to be honest, with hardware stuff, you know, we fly a lot with the gear, and sometimes it takes a hit, and sometimes I have to get in a different bass synth. And once we played in Belfast, and we still talk about it to this day. We always say, remember Belfast. Because they brought me a 101 to replace the SH9, which is close enough. Perfect. But he was like, there's one slight thing with the modulator, but it should be fine. And the trouble, it wasn't a slight thing with the modulator. It was a huge thing with the modulator, which is that every now and then, randomly, the square wave modulator would just start going off, no matter what you did, and which means your notes could go anywhere. So if you're playing a bass line that's like on a note, it could suddenly be way out and then flick to another note and then flick to another note. And so we were playing these tunes and the tuning was going like all over. And the reason why we still say remember Belfast is it was one of our best ever gigs because some of the riffs sounded so spiritual because they were so out and the sax was coming in at the weirdest harmonies. And the crowd still went bonkers, if not more bonkers. I mean, Belfast is a great town to play, but it was so far.
Did you get it on tape, Dan? Did anyone capture it?
I don't think we did. I don't think we did. But that was a real clunker, and yeah. But to be honest, yeah, sometimes these things, it's not necessarily bad when things go wrong. Sometimes it can be the best bit of the gig, or at least something that you learn a lot from, or something, you know.
Exactly. No, great perspective again. And then we're going to move on to some of our more standard questions, Dan. So the first one being, if you had to tag a keyboard player that you'd like to hear more about their career in music, who would it be?
Yeah, I was thinking there's a great player, a guy called Charlie Stacey. And he, you know, came up doing jazz, and he's quite a legend in London because he used to go to all the jazz clubs to go to the jams. But when he was 12, with his dad, so you'd get all these adults there playing. It's quite a highly competitive environment, the jazz jam, one that I didn't get involved in at all. But I heard it was really competitive, and he got this guy go along at 12 years old. He was like a child prodigy, and his dad would take him down to these clubs. But now he's, you know, grown man, and he's playing with Yusef Days, who's unbelievably good drummer. So yeah, Charlie Stacey would be my answer.
Noted. No, thank you. And then we have the dreaded Desert Island Discs question, Dan. 5 albums that you were, if you had to pick 5.
All right, I'm just gonna.
You've got the list
because I'm terrible at this kind of thing. But I did make a list. All right, here we go. So, Mahavishnu Orchestra, In a Mountain Flame. That's their first album. And it's insane in the membrane. And Jan Hammer keyboards.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Insane. And that record is like, that was a really formative record, like for me. Because they do all the jamming and the solos, but there's some great bits where they just all link together. It's very written. Beautiful record. I'm gonna go with a classic, which is Stevie Wonder's Inner Visions.
Great.
That one really was very formative for me because, you know, he plays everything on that record, pretty much, apart from some guitar on one of the tracks. So he's playing the bass on a bass synth, and, you know, that was really inspiring to me. He's on the drums, he's playing bass on the bass synth, he's got all those synth parts, and then the songwriting's obviously insane. But I love Inner Visions. Then I've gone for one that probably people won't know that well. It's by an artist called Patten, which doesn't have an R. It's like Patten. He was on Warp Records for a time. But this record is called Glakjo. I'm going to try and say it. It's quite weird, just a bunch of random letters and capitals. It's called Glakjo Zaxo.
No worries, I'll find it online, I'm sure.
I'll send it to you. But that one, it's a little, he's like almost like the London-based Flying Lotus kind of character. So unbelievable, the production in it. Loads of great synths. And it's just mind-melting psychedelic electronic music. So that's 3. All right, I'm going to go for Terry Riley and his record Shri Camel.
Okay, right.
Which is, he uses synths that are tuned differently to not to equal temperament, to like just tuning, and it's just gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous synth work. And then the next one was really hard.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go. It was either like a classic one that I really loved, or like a more modern one that I've listened to a lot.
You can do both, Dan. The amount of guests that have said 6 rather than 5, go for the 6.
So I've got James Holden here, and he's got this record called Outdoor Museum of Fractals, and it's like it's a whole album, but just one track on like modular synths with this tabla player called Camilo Torrado, and he's got these modular synths bubbling away, and it just grows and grows and grows, but with the most gorgeous programming of the arpeggiators. It's just stunning work there from James Holden. And then, yeah, my honourable mentions would just be, I mean, Court of the Crimson King, of course. Yeah. Then, like, Who's Next, you know, by The Who. Yeah. Pretty much any album by Zeppelin. Headhunters by Herbie Hancock. Yes. Fragile and Close to the Edge by Yes. You know, the list goes on and on. It's so hard to... But there you go. I've given you a 5.
No, you've done a great job. No, well done. And we then finish out with our quickfire 10. So 10 short and sharp questions that we just get your response on. So usually Paul and I will tag team, but it's all me. So first keyboard you ever owned?
First keyboard I ever owned. Oh, it was some kind of like tiny little Casio thing with like demos on it that you could play along with.
Yep, gotcha. Most important pre-gig ritual for you?
Oh, the Wim Hof breathing technique.
Oh. Yeah, nice. Yeah, it's very effective too, I've heard. Keytar's sexy or an abomination?
Sexy.
I'd assume that would be the answer.
Can I just add to that Däm Funk, this LA-based funk artist, uses one, and he calls it a shoulder synth. And I think that makes all the difference. It's not a keytar, it's a shoulder synth.
I like that. That's great. Oh, that's brilliant. I'm assuming I know the answer to this one. Transpose button or adjust on the fly?
Yeah, just on the fly.
Yeah, I would have thought, but yeah, that's right. Favourite gig, if it's possible, you've ever played to date?
Fuji Rock Festival in Japan in 2019.
Great. Yeah, the Japanese latch on to acts and loved. I assume the comedy coming is loved in Japan?
Yeah, and it was just a sea of people midnight on a Friday night, and it was the most gratifying amount of cheering you've ever heard in your life. Yeah,
that's great. And this might be a similar answer then. The favourite city you've ever played?
Well, let me switch it up, as I've just done. I mean, I bloody love playing in Tokyo, I will say. But let me go for Brussels, because Brussels, they dance from the opening seconds all the way through to the end.
Wow, so, there you go. That's not something you would expect from Brussels. Well, personally, from down here anyway. So that's great.
Crazy. Yeah.
No, that's great. Best thing about playing live?
Being in another dimension.
That's one of the best answers ever. That's great. Worst thing about playing live?
When you really need to go for a piss and you know you can't stop playing for like 3 songs. Yeah. But as a really quick aside, we've got a drum solo in our set, and sometimes I go and leg it down the corridor.
That's great.
With the drum solo still going in my in-ear monitors, so it's the most hectic run for a piss that you've ever had with this drum solo. Tap, 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 tap. And you're trying to find your way back to the backstage.
That is brilliant.
Hello.
This might link into the next question, because we've had a previous guest say that the ability to urinate whilst on stage safely would be a great invention. But is there an invention you'd like to see that would make your life as a keyboard player easier?
Yeah, a third arm. I like a Terminator style robotic arm edition. Yeah,
that's brilliant. And then last of the quick fire 10, Dan, is what do you do to keep sane outside of music? What floats your boat as far as any hobbies or non-musical activities?
I love football. I love Arsenal, and I am a very keen follower of Arsenal. So I get to the games whenever I can, and when I'm not on tour, and I love following the matches, and definitely scratches a bit of the brain, which feels very different from my creative.
No, great. And I'm going to throw in one supplementary, and that is there a question you've always wanted to be asked that you've never been asked about your career?
Yeah, I often try and think about, where it comes from, where the wellspring of creativity comes from in like different people, That's what I'm really interested in with other artists. I'm like, wonder where they're coming from, where it's one of those things that's so hard to describe, but in the act of trying to describe it, it might lead to something. But it's, why create, and where are you coming from when you're deciding what chord to play, or what sounds to use? Where is that coming from? And I know roughly what I'm going for when I'm trying to come up with sounds, and on the whole, it's like trying to connect to this whole other dimension that I've got in my head that I feel like you can express through sounds, but not with words, And that's why it's a hard thing to talk about, and why it's actually quite a crazy question to ask.
Yeah, it is.
But I feel like, it's like the whole universe is like a creative engine, and like organic life on the planet has gone from like a single-celled organism all the way to like humans, and then I'm just like part of that, linking into that process. When you're making music, it's like you're becoming part of this creative process which is already happening kind of in the universe or on this planet. So it kind of feels amazing to me to just be like part of that process. Turning nothing into something is to me very meaningful.
That is a brilliant way to finish, and I think it's something that AI can never hope to achieve in its wildest dreams, what you've just described. So that's great. Dan, I can't thank you enough for your time. It's been absolutely brilliant catching up. I feel like all of our guests, we've barely scratched the surface, but can't thank you enough.
Oh, thanks for having me, David. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope your listeners get a kick out of it.
And there we have our interview with Danalogue. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed doing it with him. As you've heard, Dan is one incredibly diverse artist with a great grasp of music and gear. And I just love the fact that he essentially sticks to the same set of gear and keeps exploring the boundaries of that gear. And I think I said in the interview, he hasn't really found those boundaries yet. So, just a really inspiring interview in a range of ways. So thank you, as always, for listening. I do want to give a quick shout out to our gold and silver supporters. We've got Electronic, elkelectronic.com.au. Also, Brother Paul Brown from the Water Boys, who's an ongoing supporter of the show. Thank you, Brother Paul, as always. Tammy Catcher of Tammy's Musical Stew, another absolutely brilliant supporter of the show, who we hugely thank for all the support she does provide. The musicplayer.com forums, where I've said many times I've proudly been a resident of since 2001 and plan on being there a lot more years to come. Dave and the team there. If you're into keyboards and you want a good forum-based way to discuss topics, doesn't get any better than musicplayer.com. And last but not least, Midnight Mastering. So Mike and the team at midnightmastering.com, if you want some great mixing and mastering work done on your creations, do shout out. I can't recommend them highly enough. So If you'd like to keep in touch with us, we've got good old-fashioned email, editor@keyboardchronicles.com. We're on Facebook at The Keyboard Chronicles. We're on Instagram at The Keyboard Chronicles. We're on TikTok at The Keyboard Chronicles. We're on LinkedIn at The Keyboard Chronicles. You get the picture. All your social media platforms of choice. We're not on Mastodon, sorry. We might have to get onto that. And we do also love hearing from you via good old-fashioned email at editor@keyboardchronicles.com. So again, thank you for listening. We do appreciate the ongoing support, and we've got lots of great shows coming up. So until then, have a great time.